Hello, my name is Carol McKibben, and I'm a lecturer in history at Stanford University. My focus is urban studies, and today we're going to take a little trip into the Alisal, which is a subdivision of Salinas with a long, long history. We're going to do it by way of memory. There's a difference between historical analysis and the memories of people who recall a period of time. And the real difference is in evidence-based historical narrative. So what we're looking for today is less evidence-based contribution to an historical narrative and more about the perceptions that people had in their own personal experiences. And those perceptions help us understand the significance of a place. Not necessarily what actually happened there, but how people perceived what happened there. That is important. So we're going to listen carefully today to three people, who lived in the Alisal in the days before the 1970 demographic shift that changed the population from a predominantly Caucasian population to a predominantly Mexican origin population. And then we're going to listen to a former mayor of Salinas, Ana Caballero, give us a sense of policy in the aftermath of that demographic shift. So we'll listen to an analysis of the mayor as to the impact of that shift, and we'll also listen to the perceptions of people who lived it. And in doing so, we hope to gain a better understanding of change and context of Salinas and of Alisal. And with that in mind, I think we should proceed to our panel. Thank you very much. My name is Carol McKibben, and I'm a lecturer in history at Stanford University and the director of an exciting new public history project sponsored by the city of Salinas that aims to rethink, rewrite, and represent the history of this city in regional, state, and national context in both the academic world and in popular culture. Place matters. And I'm here to welcome you to a conversation about a special and important place in Salinas history, Alisal, which is also known as the Alisal. This conversation is not merely to celebrate Alisal, but also to think critically about it. Alisal has occupied a liminal space in Salinas history since the inception of the city. We're here today to explore what that might mean, past and present. We have a panel of distinguished residents and former residents, including our incredible former mayor and current assembly member, Ana Caballero, here to help us. I will introduce each panelist in a moment, but first I would like to thank the City of Salinas, Salinas City Manager Ray Corpus, whose vision for the city encompasses both economic and cultural revitalization. I've known Ray for a decade. I thought he was going to be here, but obviously not. And I'll tell you that at first and foremost, he's a champion of inclusion and collaboration. We have two members of the Salinas City Council here, I think. Steve McShane? No. Okay, maybe not. And Tony Villegas? I guess not. All right, so none of this event would have been possible without the incredible support from Taylor Farms, and in the person of Margaret D'Arrigo, who's done everything from providing refreshments to making sure we have video recording capability and microphones. She is magic. I'm sorry, I don't have a table here. She's the epitome of collaboration and efficiency. She personifies the spirit of accomplishment that is integral to what defines Alisal as well as Salinas. The Salinas Chamber of Commerce, in the person of Tom Taft, thank you, Tom, where are you? Has been a vital partner providing everything from research support to connective threads in this community to publicity. Thank you, Tom. Thank you to Hartnell College for the videography and collaborative support, to Alisal High School for the use of space, and to everyone else who helped. Sandra Ocampo, Dom Shababa, Karen Cameron from the public schools, all of whom have helped in getting the word out for today. Now our panel. We'll begin in a moment. I'm going to introduce everybody first, and then you can start, Patricia, with Patricia Jane Adcock Garlinger, who began her life in Alisal decades ago, in the years preceding the Dust Bowl migration, so the 1920s. Her family, both hers and her husband's, have roots in the 19th century, from the very first migrations of Danish and Swedish immigrants. And she has been involved in ranching in Alisal ever since. Got it? Right? Okay. As part of a ranching family, she watched critical demographic and environmental changes in Salinas over the course of the 20th century, which she will share with us today. Her family owned and operated the very first water company in Salinas, in Alisal, and generously helped newcomers to this place make their, establish themselves over the course of the entire 20th century. Assemblyperson Ana Caballero has been a public servant for over 30 years. She was elected as Salinas' first female mayor in 1998 and is responsible for, among so many innovations and great positive policies, raising funds to save our libraries and provided critical city services during a time when we were in a statewide budget crisis. She was elected to the State Assembly in 2006, and in that role has been a most committed and successful advocate for residents here, ameliorating policy in everything from recreational facilities to healthcare to water uses and access to building affordable housing and reducing crime due to gang violence. Bill Ramsey was born and raised in the Alisal. He's a child of the Dust Bowl who married his Salinas High School sweetheart, Marlene Sabrana, in 1951. They're married still. He joined Mann Packing in 1955 and became a partner in the company along with Don Nucci and Horace Mann in 1976. And he played football? Yeah. Sorry. His family still leads this firm. Bill has served on the Salinas School Board as president and in multiple capacities in Salinas as a public servant and community leader. His heart is here. He's a gracious, kind, generous person, as Patricia and Anna are as well, with a deep commitment to this community and great insight into the growth and development of Salinas over the course of the 20th century. Jim Gaddis is also a child of the Dust Bowl, an accomplished businessman, the founding director of the Salinas International Air Show, which just happened. His numerous awards reflect his commitment to this city and to its people. He won a Spirit of the Community Award, Citizen of the Year, Humanitarian of the Year, board member for the Salinas Valley Memorial Hospital. And like Bill, one of the kindest, most gracious, generous souls with a deep commitment to Salinas and great insight into the changing face of this city. We can see from these life stories a common thread of upward mobility based on an incredible work ethic, optimistic outlook, perseverance, and a heartfelt commitment to this community that is reflected in both action and words. All of our panelists are both observers of critical change and activists and change agents themselves. So we would like to begin our panel with a brief contribution from each of our panelists about what Salinas meant to them, what their experience has been in this city, and what they hope to dispel in terms of myths about Alisal that have been so prevalent, not just in the media, but in academic accounts as well. So let's begin with Patricia, who, by the way, is turning 39 tomorrow.
59.
59. Reverse that and you've got it.
Sounds a lot better. First, I would like to thank you very much, Carol, for asking me to be on the panel. I appreciate it. I am serving for my...
One moment, please.
Could I just ask, we have an interpreter here, and I was wondering if there's anyone that needs interpretation service. ¿Hay alguien que necesite un intérprete para entender la presentación? ¿Nadie? Okay, great. Thank you so much. I just wanted to check. Thank you, Luz, for being here.
Go ahead.
I want to thank you, Carol, very much for asking me. I'm sitting in place of my younger sister, Joanne, who is in the hospital today and doing well, I hope. I haven't had a chance to talk to her. But first I want to ask, is there anybody that lived in the Alisal before 1924? Or 25?
You're alone.
I was born October 8, 1922 in Salinas on Maple Street. My dad was a U.S. postal employee, my mother a stay-at-home mother, and he wanted to move to a ranch or a country. Well, you know who won? My dad won. So out we tootled, my dad, my mother, my sister, and I, out to Route 2, Box 105, Del Monte Avenue, and there we started our life in the Alisal. Fortunately, it was right next door to the Alisal school, and so I just climbed through the fence and went to school every day. I went to school there for 6 years until all of a sudden a schoolhouse appeared on the grounds one day, and we all said, "What's happening?" And we found out they'd unified with the Alisal school district. So we had to change our name to the Alisal school. Well, that was terrible. We just thought that was terrible they'd do that to us. And so then I proceeded to graduate in 1936 from the Alisal school. Attended Salinas Union High School till 1940. I became hostess of the California Rodeo in 1940, one of the greatest moments of my life. I went on to attend Salinas Junior College, which is now Hartnell. Graduated with an AA degree, then went on to get my very special degree of Mrs. M.R.S. Garlander. So that was the history of what I did. As if you all would close your eyes and think about the Alisal, with no houses, just beautiful old fields with pigs and cattle and dried grain being grown, and just about 3 or 4 houses from Del Monte Avenue into town over the railroad tracks. And then you open your eyes today, and my heavens, I drove out and I thought, it's happened. It's a community. It's a metropolis full of everything. And that's what I was raised in, was a quiet, peaceful little country town. We finally got a grocery store on the corner of Del Monte and Williams Road, signs of the time, and it was run by a Chinaman, and it was Billy, and we loved Billy, and we'd ride our bicycles down the end of Del Monte Avenue go down way down to off of Sanborn Road, and we go to a grocery store there to buy my mother a loaf of bread. This was before Billy's grocery store, and there was a big pig farm down there and a dairy. And then where the old barn was, which is now Chavez Library, was a dairy, and I used to walk down there to get milk for the family in a little bucket. I can still remember walking down Williams Road. So I was trying to think if there's anything else that I could tell you about it. My dad started the water company in 1932. He had sold some property off to some people, and they were getting water. He provided water for them, and somebody got an idea that something went wrong, and they reported it to the PUC. And they said, "Mr. Adcock, you've got to either start a water company or quit selling water to them." So they had a big argument, my mother and dad. My dad won. So he started the water company, and there were the 4 of us by that time. I was the oldest, my sister Jerry, my brother Tom, who was deceased, and my sister Joanne. And I married, and I left the Alisal in 1942, married a farmer, which I was never going to do, but I did. raised 5 daughters, and I'm living to be almost 95 tomorrow.
Thank you.
That's my story.
Thanks, Pat. My story is a little different. Interesting, I'm 85, Pat's 95, so we had a decade in between us. And you'll find that Jim's about 5 years younger than I am, so there's a different recollection of the Alisal. So going back to the Ramsey family, how did we end up out here? Well, my dad was a cotton farmer and a cattle rancher in Texas. In 1929, during one of the peaks of the Depression, we lost our ranch. So my mother, I want you to picture something. My mother and dad and 9 kids came out here in one car. And I look back and think that's impossible. How could you get 11 people into a car and then travel across half the United States? But they did. They arrived here in 1930, and I was born in 1932. So I guess I was just a gleam in my father's eye when he left Texas. But I was the 10th of those 9 children, and then I had a younger sister, Margaret. So the total in the Ramsey family was 11 of us. A couple of things that are kind of not understood well. We had the Depression in the United States, and that's when my dad lost his business. We also had the Dust Bowl. There were 2 separate entities that kind of happened at the same time. But the Dust Bowl was more in the 30s, and the Depression started somewhere in the 20s. So we got out here, and I actually lived in Salinas from the time I was born, in 1932, till 1940, and it was then that the Ramsey family moved to the Alisal. And it had to do with economics. We probably didn't have any money. So we moved out to a street called Bonita Street, and I went to the Sherwood School. I did this in the 3rd grade. And then we moved to Alisal Street, and I was in the 3rd grade. And then we moved to a place called Pacific Avenue that Pat and I were just talking about, and I was still in the 3rd grade. And all this was at Sherwood School and Alisal Elementary School. So time came and went, and then I went to Alisal School when I was in the 6th grade and the 7th grade, and that's when I became acquainted. You and I were chatting about Mrs. Barton, Mrs. Rocco. You know, I must tell you that the decade that the Ramsey family lived in Alisal was just about perfect. No one had anything to speak of, so our chances of having something stolen from us was slim and none. That wasn't going to happen. And there was also a time, and I remember it well because I was 9 years old, and the Second World War began. And I remember exactly when I got up on a Sunday morning. And I remember my 2 brothers going into the military at that time. And I remember the war coming and going and ending. And then I remember Alisal flourishing. And for those of you who don't know it, there was a time when Salinas wanted Alisal to join Salinas. And the citizens of the Alisal elected not to do that. So for a period of time, I guess some of the elders of the Alisal district thought, well, we're going to have our own city of Alisal. But then they had a second election, and Alisal did join Salinas. But during the decade that I was living out here, it was wonderful. How did we pass the time? Well, we went to school, and we played baseball, and we played football, and we did it in the streets, and we did it at Fremont School, and we did whatever we did. And life was simple, and it was pure. And one of the other misnomers about the Alisal was that we were the dumb Okies. And if you remember the history, John Steinbeck coined that phrase, if I have my history correct. And yes, a whole bunch of folks came from Oklahoma, and a whole bunch of folks came from Texas, which we did. And a whole bunch of folks came from Arkansas. But nonetheless, we were looked upon as the Okies. And I look back at my dad's business when he lost it. I even have a deed of a ranch he bought in 1928 in Texas. So he, like a lot of people, and I'm sure Jim's family, we were not the dumb Okies. We were part of the Great Depression when this country lost so many things. And my family lost that too. But the pressure, the Dust Bowl was a little different. You know, to go a quick history, we killed all the buffalo, we moved the Indians off the country, we plowed all the ground in the Midwest, and we had a drought. Not necessarily in that combination of events, but all that happened. So the consequence of no water and a lot of plowing and First World War, we did the dirt in, hence the Dust Bowl. And then over time, through a lot of education, they corrected that problem, and that world went by. In 1950, I was still living in the Alisal, and I had started Hardnell and didn't like school much. I was better playing football, by the way, than I was at being a student. So I joined the Navy in 1951, put Hardnell to join the Navy. And the world in Salinas and Alisal changed between the time I left in 1951 and came back in 1955. There was a change in population in the Alisal. There was a change in movement. There had been some development because after the Second World War, the city of Salinas began to develop. And so it was. I think I'll just stop there and let Jim talk about his tenure in the Alisal, and then if you have any questions, I can talk about my time. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Bill. It's interesting when I drive around in Alisal, the various places we lived, I'm just flooded with memories of childhood memories. Some friends and instructors that are right here today, L.G. Polizio being a great coach that we had, a great mentor, all of us, and a fellow classmate, Augie Skornianki, who talk about a success story of coming out of Alisal, went on to become superintendent of schools in Alameda County, and Bob Sartwell became superintendent of schools over in Santa Clara County, wherever it was, and Everett Alvarez, of course, you all know his history. So anyway, it was great memories and great folks that I grew up with here. But our family came, as Bill said, we came during the Dust Bowl era, and my father came out. They came from Arkansas, and the first year they came out was 1935. And I'm the youngest of four boys. I'm the only one that was born in California. 3 other boys were born in Arkansas. So each time at the end of each season, working in the fields, they would go back home during the winter, and whatever empty seats they had, they brought cousins with them or uncles or brothers. So the transition took from 1935 to 1941, in which my grandmother and grandfather finally decided that their whole family had moved out to Salinas or to Alisal, and that they had no family left. So they followed and came out in 1941. So I was born in Salinas down in the corner where downtown Chevron actually was, on the corner of Monterey and San Luis Streets. A lot of people don't know, but there was the Salinas Valley Hospital was there, and that was the Dr. Reeves' hospital. Dr. Reeves. Yeah, and so I was born on that spot. But we lived all over Alisal, and I went to Sherwood School, and then we were the first class through Alisal Junior High School. The first 7th grade, which was 1949, then the first 8th grade, and then the first 9th grade, and we were very upset about having to spend 3 years in school, because I think Washington Junior High before that, correct me if I'm wrong, was only 7th and 8th grade. So we were looking forward to being freshmen at high school, and we weren't allowed to. We were 3 years at El Sal Junior High. So ultimately, when it went down to Salinas High, and my particular case is a little a little unusual in as much as I was married very young at age 15. We grew up pretty fast out here. I was driving a lettuce truck at age 14 and lied to get my license, and my brothers had taught me how to do it. And we were driving a truck, and so I dropped out of school didn't go to high school in my junior year. I was working at nighttime at Greyhound, and I finally realized one night about 2 in the morning when I was loading luggage in the rain, I'd better go back and at least get a high school education. I don't want to do this. And so I went back and was able to finish with my class in 1955, and I took both years in one, the junior and senior year, and worked at the bus station at nighttime doing that. So I graduated with my class, and recently at a class reunion, the class president said, "I'm confused because I'm looking into your book, and you're in both the junior class and the senior class." How did that happen? So in our family, I'm the first one to graduate high school. We broke that cycle, and the unusual part about it, of course, is that I had a pregnant wife and a son sitting in the audience when we did that. So we got a pretty early start there, and went on, and I've been fortunate and done all sorts of different things in different businesses, and been involved in all kinds of different nonprofit activities. And it's been a wonderful range of experiences for me, and it's really been a wonderful ride. But I go back to the roots here in Alisal and our families, and I think about that. And this was a destination for us. This wasn't just a transitory place. This was what we were looking for. My family coming from Arkansas, they were looking for a place that my father wanted me to buy his own house, and I had my brothers and I put it together later on and bought him a house near Gloucester Park later in their lives. But and we all pitched together and built my grandmother and grandfather a house over on Felice Street. And so everybody was a carpenter or a mechanic in those days, and things were a lot simpler, but we all worked together. There was a lot of pride. My family was very, very good. We never had any money, but my parents had two things. It was their children and their church, and that was they were Baptists. I was a member of the Hebron Heights Missionary Baptist Church, and I was baptized at the top of the hill on Market Street over there, across from Wings Market. So anyway, a lot of fond memories and wonderful times. I think, and Carol had mentioned once about what do you think historically has changed about Alisal, and I think a couple of things changed it, certainly demographically. The number one thing is a technological thing in agriculture, when there was a switch from packing in the sheds to field pack. And because all of my aunts and uncles and brothers and so forth, they worked in sheds or drove trucks in the agriculture work. I didn't see them doing any stoop labor. The fields were half Braceros and half Filipinos when I was driving a lettuce truck. But we went through that transition, and it became field pack. And the Bracero program went away. A combination of those two changed the demographics in Alisal considerably. And it took a little time to do that. I'm not sure how long the transition went. But it was home to us. It was a place we were comfortable. It was people that we were all sharing the same experiences. And it was really pretty nice. Thank you. Go ahead.
Well, first let me just say that I'm really honored to be on this panel. These are some incredible leaders and people that have contributed tremendously to the city of Salinas, and to hear their stories really is wonderful, because I don't think it's changed that much, honest to goodness. I moved to Salinas. My background is I grew up in Southern California, and I was a child of the civil rights movement, and so I was really inspired to go to law school and to move to Salinas to work with farm workers, and that's really how I got here. expected to move to Salinas, work here a couple of years, and then move back down where my family was located in Southern California. And I fell in love with the community. So my first apartment was living on Seaver Street. And I lived there for a year, decided to make a commitment, and I bought a house, and I lived over here on Carriage Drive, right next to the Ocampos, and lived there for about 11 years. And what happened is that I went to law school because I wanted to help give people legal advice and help them to change their life. And what I realized is that you can do it have much bigger impact if you get involved politically. And so what happened is we started looking around, and there were a lot of vacant properties. There were a lot of single homes, small 800 square foot homes that were being removed, and an apartment, a concrete pad was put with apartments going sideways, and it was creating a congestion and a change in the neighborhoods that many of us felt concerned about. And so we started looking around to figure out who's on the city council, who's on the school board, what's happening in our neighborhood that we don't know about. And in the interim, what had happened is, and I think one of the biggest myths that's out there is that the Alisal was created by the city of Salinas, and that it was neglected, and it was a segregated community. But that's not really true. No. I mean, you heard the history. It was a county unincorporated area that started off very rural and very rustic, and as people came in the different waves, they built their homes, they started subdividing the properties, and it was back before the apartments, there were a lot of single-family homes, one right after another, and it's a lot less dense when you have single-family homes. And what happened is that as people had the opportunity to leave, I think, and investors came in and wanted to create rental units, is they started putting these concrete boxes. Really, there's no street trees. There isn't enough parking, and so it started creating this density. And then along with all of that, quite frankly, Soledad Prison was built. And Soledad Prison initially housed very low-level offenders. And at one point, and I don't know what the timing was, but at one point it shifted, and they started, they changed it, and they brought in the high-risk offenders, which were the people that were sentenced there for very serious crimes. And so you had murders, attempted murders, robberies, and what that did is it brought the families who wanted to be closer to the prisoners. And I think that level of crime in the region really has created challenges for the surrounding area, because that it professionalized the gangs and the little warring factions and groups that were involved in criminal behavior. So part of this is this transition, and you hear about the transition. But what happened when people started changing out the single-family homes for apartments is that it created challenges, because county unincorporated areas don't usually worry about curbs, gutters, sidewalks, and streetlights. So those aren't the things that are built to city standards. And so what happened is that you ended up with a whole area of the community that looked very different from the downtown area. And so there was this distinction of a community that had been planned, which is the South Salinas community, as opposed to a community in Alisal that was changing and when there was no plan. And that's really how I got involved in politics, is that we started a Democratic club in order to try to get people to end up on school boards. We also started at the same time an Alisal Betterment Committee, and it was the ABC. The ABC was made up of a really diverse group of individuals. Gary Carnes, myself, my husband, Juan Uranga, McGregor Eddy. There were a number of us that were on that the ABC. And what we did is we started interviewing candidates. We wanted to know what's what are your priorities? What are you going to do in the Alisal? What do you want to see happen here? And that beginning of political activity led us to believe that it was important to have district elections in the city of Salinas, because no one on the city council actually lived in East Salinas any longer, and so we wanted to have some representation. So those were political movements that started changing the dynamics of what was happening, and I think in the end it was really important because the zoning in this area was 40 units per acre, which is the highest. You never get 40 units per acre in a rural community, but it was really destabilizing the community because we had no parks, or relatively few parks. I mean, put it that way. Gloucester Park was really the biggest park, and we didn't have open space. It was difficult to play on the streets now because you had a lot more traffic. It became the only entrance and exits from the city was on Laurel, and then also on Alisal and John Street. And so there was this need to kind of integrate the Alisal in with the rest of the community. So there were a lot of priorities that we set on the council based on some of the challenges that having an annexing a county unincorporated to a city is required if you're really going to have people feel like it's important to have everybody feel together. So the biggest challenge is kind of overcoming the myths, but the other biggest challenge is to get people, because the immigration that's occurred between 1965 and now is from Mexico. There are language issues, there's culture issues, and there's the issue with having people feel like they really belong in the community. And that has to do with people may not be documented, and so they're afraid, they're scared, they don't feel like they can participate in a political arena, and part of what I've tried to do over the years, and we did it through Partners for Peace, a nonprofit focused on reducing gang violence, was to have the community have the members of the community feel like they were part of the bigger community, and we did a number of activities to try to make that happen. So I want to stop because I know we want to get some questions and have a discussion.
We do want to have a discussion. I just want to, my historian's voice is shouting in my head. You are talking about a lot in a lot of decades. So you arrived here in what year?
I arrived here in 1979.
Okay, so we're talking about the 80s, of this big transitional era of the 80s. So what we heard from the panel is that in the 20s, this is a very sparsely settled place, mostly ranches. And then the twin catastrophes of the 1929 Depression, the crash, followed by the 1933 environmental catastrophe of the Dust Bowl, which really devastated the Southwest and sent a huge wave of refugees to California and elsewhere, led to a new population in the Alisal. But this population has been caricatured in some ways as not very intelligent or whatever. And what we see is a really consistent settlement pattern that suggests that the Alisal was always populated by people who were aimed to own a home, aimed to start small businesses, aimed to move up the socioeconomic ladder. That is the consistency. And the problems that Assembly Member Caballero has pointed out are fairly recent, but the population, the goals, the values of the population seems to be consistent to me. We're all the same people. So with that in our mind's eye, I'd like to invite the audience to come up and share your stories and ask questions of this wonderful panel that is so rich in history of this special place. Blessies. Would anyone like to start? Peter.
I've got a question about the physical separation of the South from the East. The railroad always had separation, but you could drive across it. You still can in some places. But then, this probably happened after you left the Alisal, but there was a freeway that came by and reinforced that physical separation. And I wonder what your recollections are of how that happened and what impact it had on Salinas.
And when it happened?
I don't think that would have anything much to do with it, with the Alisal, the highway. The railroad, when they put the underpass under the railroad, that was a big deal, because that kind of opened it up too, you know. Otherwise, it was just farmers and cattle running down Williams Road being sent to the slaughterhouse, and I can remember sitting on the fence and watching that happen. But as far as I can recall, I left in 42, yeah, the freeway was through. It didn't, in my estimation, didn't affect it.
Peter, we lived before the overpasses, and the common comment was, you go into little Oklahoma when you pass the railroad tracks, and you better be careful, because that's where all the Okies live. Is that about right, Jeff?
All the Okies were there.
But now it is, when you remember things from your vantage point, the time you
There
were
were
growing.
plenty plain old Americans there.
It's interesting that I so distinctly remember when Highway 101 went down Monterey Street. You know, you came in, if you were going from San Francisco to Los Angeles, you went down Monterey Street in Salinas before the freeway was built. There was always an incredible amount of traffic, and the car dealers were all right there. And on the corner of Monterey and Alisal Street is where all of the kids that weren't old enough to have a car stood and hitchhiked to Alisal on that corner. And you weren't your safety. You weren't concerned about your safety, and everybody that was going out would stop and pick you up. And then when you got ready to go to town, you'd run out here on Alisal and Market Street and thumb a ride to town, and that's where you went.
And you're talking about the 50s and 60s.
Yeah, that was early 50s. I think that, I'm not sure, but I think the freeway came through about middle to some
So the
middle
formal
50s,
annexation
right
takes
there.
place in 1963,
Yeah.
and Anna, you're talking about the 1980s when this overbuilding happens
Sure.
and when the impact of the prison happens. So that's the 1980s. That's when you started reconsidering politically.
I think Anna really hit upon something about the prisons. That was a dramatic change in the makeup or the gangs or whatever happened. The greatest of the 10, you have a prison to take care of those that need to go to prison, but the consequences, the unintended consequences, were and are incredible.
So that was a big turning point. Questions, comments, stories. I want to hear your stories. Don't be shy, and unlike Peter, come up to the microphone so we can record you. Tell us your name.
My name is Edward Moncrief. And,
Edward, would you like to use the microphone? Thank you.
We started Chispa in 1980, and we started by finding what was then the most rundown block in the city, and that was the street of Madeira between Market and Alisal. And that is one place where many of the migrants came in the 30s, and they put up tents, and after a year or two, they were able to build some rather modest 15 by 15 structures, Monterey construction as they call it. And those structures were still there in 1980, occupied mostly by Mexican immigrant farm workers. And there was 39 homes on the block between Market and Roosevelt Street and up the hill where you were living, I guess. And so we started buying up parcels. And the folks that we bought the parcels from lived over in Carmel or wherever they lived. But I just have a couple of quick stories. One is that one of those parcels had an heir who had to sign off. So I had to track down where this person was, and we didn't have Google back then. And we finally came up with an address over in Los Banos. And the gentleman with his wife was living in a trailer court in Los Banos. And we drove over there, my family and I, on a very, very hot July day, and went to the trailer court and had to leave my 2 boys and wife in the car, Judy, and went over to the trailer door, and I knocked on the door, and the door opened, and here was this 70 to 80-ish, very wiry, tough-looking woman, and this 70 to 80-ish, very wiry, thin, tough-looking guy. And they said, "Come on in." So I sat at the table with this couple, and they started telling me their story. And first of all, I have to say, they were chain-smoking Lucky Strike cigarettes without any filters. And the gentleman says, "Well, you know, I come out there and sometime in the early 30s, and I put my tent on that piece of property, me and my wife, not this one, my other wife. And we lived there for a few years, and we finally were able to build something, and I spent many a good year on that block." And it was just wonderful to see that era, and to see the folks who are still out there, we're still out there, and to meet someone who had helped settle the Alisal. The second very quick story is that when we bought the auto dismantling yard from Mr. Eli Boozer, which was between Roosevelt and Alisal Street. It was called a junkyard by most people, but it was an auto dismantling yard. We bought that block where the cliff is, if you will, and we found out that when the folks did the measuring across from Roosevelt to Alisal, one surveyor went this far, and the other surveyor went this far, and so there were 2 parcels that did not connect. And underneath, there were owners that owned 3 feet of land along the whole block, and several of them. And we had to go find those people and get them to sign off and pay them whatever they required. But it was just very interesting that back then the surveys
beyond
weren't
interesting.
necessarily
It's important because I think what Anna was saying was that there was a critical difference between being part of a city neighborhood and being part of a county and not having the benefit of county interest or city interest and funds for infrastructure, which is problematized in the 1980s, not so much in the early period. It didn't seem to matter. Your dad supplied water for people if they didn't have water access. He just gave it to them. And in the 30s and 40s, people came and built homes and didn't really worry over much about little trivial legalities, right? So it's only in the 1980s that we see some concern. This is 20 years after incorporation, or at 20 years after annexation, that there's concern, that there is this overbuilding, there are populations coming in that need housing that can't find it. So, Anna, I'm trying to understand, like, when you got involved in politics, what were your policy options? What were your decisions that you had to make with the city council? When were you elected to city council? And what did you try to do to alleviate what is now turning into a problem in the 1980s? It wasn't so much of a problem before. Even though Jim and Bill have told me stories about getting into fights, that was different. That was different than what you found in the 1980s. That was pretty serious. So what were some of the actions that you took as a policymaker to make change?
Well, I ended up on the Planning Commission between 85 and 89, and what we started doing was we rezoned the area and prohibited the kind of developments that were happening, and then started looking at changing some of the zoning in the area so that there wouldn't be as much housing, but there would be commercial opportunities, because that was part of the challenge, is that you got a lot of little stores, but not the bigger stores once you got past what used to be the Montmartre. And part of what we were doing was trying to figure out how we were going to change the traffic patterns, because it was hard to get around once you got out here to the Alisal. Now everybody thinks, oh, you just jump on Freedom Parkway or Barond Road, but those didn't exist back then. And so Laurel was pretty congested. And we wanted to try to, for the city as a whole, there were a number of things happening. One is, it was mentioned that there was a change in the way that ag production was happening, but what also happened is the value added really took off, and that was the ability to have the breathable bags, the salad. And I'm not the best person to be talking about agriculture, but it's interesting to me, and it fascinated me, because when I first got to Salinas, when they were growing head lettuce, they would pick maybe a third of the field, and then they'd disc the rest under. And I'd be paying $2 a head for lettuce, and I'd look out the window and go, "Oh my God, they're disking it! Let me run out there and grab a couple heads of lettuce. I want to get it for free." They're just disking it under, and it ended up that those heads were not packaged in the field. They were brought in, and they were wrapped and put into boxes in a processing facility.
The ones they were disking under?
No, the ones that were picked.
Oh.
But then what happened is that once they developed the breathable bag, they would go through and pick the breathable bag, and also the ability to pack in the field. So the head gets cut, and it gets wrapped and put in the box, and it hits the cooler within 20 minutes. But then the rest is thrown in the back of a truck. It's taken down to a processing facility, and they chop it up. It doesn't matter what they were doing is picking the prettiest heads, because that's what we want. But the ones that weren't as pretty, they were just disking under. And so instead, they were getting chopped up, put into a bag, and now you pay 3 times what you would have paid for the head of lettuce. But that really revolutionized, because it created all these jobs in the packing facilities, and it also created no waste in the field, which meant a lot more work for people. So we needed more workers, but we also needed them to be around year-round. So there was a lot less migrant stream coming through the city. And so as a policymaker, the challenge we have always had is the lack of affordable housing. And that's been kind of my number one issue for 20 years. I got on the city council in 1991, I'm sorry, 1991. And the issues that we were facing were affordable housing, lack of open space. We doubled the park space when I was on the council. We had a real need for economic development, and the car dealers wanted to be located in town, and they wanted to be located together, and they were required to have new facilities, and the only way they could get that was if they moved to new facilities. Their parent companies were requiring them to have the latest technology, and so they were either going to stay in Salinas and we were going to make land available, or they're going to move somewhere else. So it is pressure, and they generate per near, I think, between 20 and 25% of the sales tax in the city, and that's really important. I think the underscore of all of this is the hardest thing about being the mayor of Salinas is that we never ever have enough revenue. We have a very young population, somewhere in the neighborhood of 28 is our median age, and our revenue is significantly below per capita communities surrounding us, and that includes Watsonville, Gilroy. Back in the day, Monterey had more than 4 times the amount per capita. San Jose had twice the per capita. And so we always struggled economically, because with young people, you have a lot of needs. You have library needs, you have park needs, you have school needs, and we were trying to meet all of that at a time when the state budget was going up and down, and it was very, very hard under good circumstances, and it was harder during...
Not under good circumstances.
Yep.
And you mentioned the age of the population, and Sam Pacheco, I'm going to embarrass you and make you come up here, because you teach students at Hartnell, many of whom live in Alisal. What are your biggest, do you agree with what you've heard here? I know you teach California history, so do you have a comment or question that you can come up and share with us? Come up. Come up is the key word. Key word. There's the mic, Sam. I'm going to make you do this. You can do this. You come on.
Yeah, it's weird. Anyway, I really want to know about Pat. Where did your family come here? Where did your dad come from? Your
My
mom?
father was born in San Francisco. My mother was born right on the corner of Pajaro and Harvest Street in Salinas. And when she grew up, they moved to Berkeley, and my dad's family moved out to Prunedale. I'm liking, why is Alisal from Sweden? My grandmother.
Sweden. Yeah.
And my grandmother was born in Sweden.
Right.
I've gone back to see where she was born.
Oh,
Yeah, it
wonderful.
was wonderful. Yeah, and so she raised 7 children, 5 boys and 2 girls there on Harvest Street.
I have a lot of questions, if you don't
Go
mind.
for it.
So we're working with, some of my students, we're working and doing research, helping Carol, and we're going through the Hartnell yearbook, so now I'm gonna look at you guys. I went to Hartnell when you were,
Class of 42.
okay, I'll look at that. The one thing that I'm finding out looking, that it looked like kids of different ethnicities got along pretty well.
I went to the Alisal school with Bill Chinaman. We called them Chinaman.
Yeah.
Chinese boys, and we were very, and Japanese. The Masuda family used to live off of Sanborn Road down on the Machado property, and we were very dear friends with all of them. There was none of this racial stuff. It was everybody.
But one thing I did find through the research was that we're going through the 1928 yearbook for Salinas High School. And you know how they do advertisements for companies or restaurants? And there was one restaurant, actually I take it back, it's 1937, that basically was promoting that their hired staff is all white. And it was called Ray's, and I think it was off of Solid, and like a diner. So when I was trying to figure out what was that like, because I saw Japanese American students that were hanging out with white students. It looked like a basketball coach at Salinas High School a baseball coach was Japanese in 1930.
Oh, yeah.
So you're getting all this types of
They were very,
different
very
messages.
smart. Very smart.
But you're making a good point about racial definitions in those years that were really, this is before World War II, this is before the Holocaust. People really did believe in racial hierarchies. And we had very strict legislation about race and space. But what you found also in the high school, in the Hartnell yearbook, that I thought was important, you found a Filipino club at Hartnell. So our assumption that all Mexican origin immigrants were laborers, all Filipino immigrants were laborers, is really a little oversimplified. That we need to pay attention to difference within groups. We need to look at not just class, but also, we need to look at not just race, but also class within races, and and understand that there wasn't this homogeneity that we assume for other people. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Actually, that's real important because you have to contextualize it. I had a neighbor when I lived over on Carriage Court who, Manuel Luz was his name, and a Filipino who worked in the fields, who started his career working in the fields. And he was he was older than I was. I was in my 20s and he was 80 years old. And he told me that he was really proud of the fact that I was an attorney, because he always wanted to be an attorney, but they wouldn't let him go to law school. And that always struck me. I felt very sad for him because he was really proud of the change in society, but that he was prohibited from getting an education, and it had always been his dream when he came from the Philippines. So we got along very well. He was considered a friend of ours. And the oldest Filipino club in California, I believe, is the Filipino Women's Club here in Salinas. And so there have been these organizations that have been around for a really long time and have, they really, one of the members of the club was Connie Sonico, who was an elected official for many, many years, actually a Hartnell College trustee. So there were opportunities, but I think through the fraternal organization sometimes it made it possible for them to be successful, step out and go do things as well.
That's true, but it's also, what you're pointing out also is something that you pointed out earlier and that everyone kind of alluded to. And it wasn't that Alisal was a segregated space. It was segregated, all right, but based on class, not on race. And I think we assume segregation based on race. There was segregation based on race in Salinas, absolutely. But Alisal was not one of those places. And when you describe it in the years of the 20s, 30s, and 40s, what you describe is a place of Dust Bowl settlement, refugees from the Dust Bowl, and also Asian settlement. That Asian migration was completely cut off in the teens and 20s. But people had already arrived and had generationally settled here. And so you settled in Alisal when you were on the move upward, right? That was your first home. But it wasn't something that you were forced to do because of race. And that was an important distinction.
My name's Robin Cohen, and I've kind of lost track of who has lived through which generations as a kind of, they'd be old enough to remember, so I'll just put this out generally. So I'm just wondering, what was it like in Salinas when the Japanese families were rounded up and brought to the rodeo grounds? How did people react? Anybody who was there, how did your family
Sunday
react,
when
and
you
how,
went to school
what?
that next morning, and there were none of your Japanese friends were there.
That's
all we knew.
That's what happened.
Well, where did they go?
But I mean, was there any activism? Did people respond? Was there solidarity? Did people
Well,
just
they
be like,
agreed
I
with
guess?
it. I mean, here we were in
Use the
war.
microphone, please.
Here,
Oh.
speak closely to it.
Oh, okay. Well, I wasn't sure how
That's
this
okay.
works. Okay. So my
That's a great
question is,
question.
was there, it happened, so, but was there any organizing or solidarity or activism in the community of acts of solidarity, of sympathy, or was it just like, well, I guess this is what's happening and we're at war, this has, I don't
How
know.
did you feel, you probably weren't alive when Pearl Harbor came and you heard that we were bombed by the Japanese. The first thing you thought of was that's the enemy.
But the Germans were not thought of that way, and that's the strange thing in the United States.
When when I went to school at Fremont School, the war began. I was in the 4th grade. I had a couple of Japanese friends. I had a couple of Hispanic or Mexican friends, but the most of us were these Caucasian Okies from Oklahoma, Texas, and Arkansas. Those are the people I knew. And yes, I had one or two good Japanese friends, and I didn't really question where they went. I knew what happened in the Rodeo Grounds. I saw that. And I saw my friends when the war came back. But during the war, there was no upheaval about our Japanese friends or our German friends or our Italian friends. We were just living. And the war came along, so two of my brothers went into the military. One became an aerial gunner and a torpedo bomber. One was killed in Korea as a first lieutenant, and one was bombing Japan, the third brother-in-law, in a B-29 as a navigator. So it was just a time, there was no separation or no hatred that I knew of, that I experienced. It wasn't that way.
It was pretty well documented, and Salinas was the city that California policymakers kind of looked to see what was going to happen. It was pretty well documented that there was an almost universal support for the internment of the Japanese. It was a policy that was carried out really systematically. Not only were there almost no voices speaking out against that, but people were pretty united that it was the right thing to do and enormously fearful that California was going to be bombed any second. There were blackouts, there was a lot of hysteria. There were Chinese people in Salinas who had been shot on the street because they were mistaken for Japanese. So Chinese people started wearing buttons that said, "I am Chinese," because they were so fearful. And there was a lot of confusion about what to do with Germans and Italians, but because they were perceived as whites, there was a lot less fear. One judge said something to the effect that, well, we know when we look in the eyes of an Italian person or a German person if they're a good guy or a bad guy, but we can't tell with the Japanese, so they all have to go. And very, very few Japanese, including the Japanese American Citizen League, which was supposed to be supporting their own people, objected to the internment. In fact, the one person who stood up and said no, Fred Korematsu, who is now considered a hero, he sued the U.S. government, and successfully to a point, was ostracized when he was forced into the camps. His girlfriend, who was Caucasian, suggested that he have plastic surgery to change his eyes, and he did, but that didn't fool anyone. So he was interned, and he was really stigmatized in the camps for rebelling. So to answer your great question, there was almost a unanimous support for that policy initiative. Unfortunately, it's a shameful period in American history, and it has yet to really be
Right. And
challenged.
so I'm just
Yeah.
bringing it up because when I hear it
Yeah,
said
but
that there's
everybody here were
harmony-
children.
I know,
Yeah,
I know.
yeah.
But when you hear there's harmony, I think there's an undercurrent
Right.
that's not really being addressed. But
Right, yeah.
My other question is, at that time, and my understanding is that when the Japanese were interned, there was a mad land rush for their holdings.
That's
So-
not quite true. That's not quite true. There was a lot of loss of property, but there were people who protected property for their neighbors too.
Right, I'm sure there
Handful.
were exceptions.
Yeah,
I'm
exceptions,
sure there
yeah.
were exceptions, but I imagine that there was
Yeah.
a great transfer of resources here in Salinas even, right?
Must be documented.
Yeah, I don't know.
You know, when Jim and I grew up here in the Alisal, am I on? Can you hear me? When we grew up in Salinas, there was only one high school. I told Carol this last week. We came from Santa Rita, and Santa Rita School District. We came from San Bernardino, District. We came from Castroville in the elementary district. We came from Alisal in the elementary district, and we melted at the Salinas High School. That was, and that's the way it was. And now, when some of you live here and you see the high school, we're sitting here in Alisal, and a high school in North Carolina, and a high school here and a high school there. There was no racial tension. It didn't.
Did you accidentally turn off your mic?
Am I doing something wrong?
It's on? Okay.
Okay. So it didn't exist. The only time I ran into a racial thing, when my wife and I got married in 1951, we both went to Smith High School. Had it not been for me, my wife would have been a Stanford graduate. Carol.
I know, but she made a good choice.
And so we went, I joined the Navy, and when I got out of boot camp, I got stationed in Memphis, Tennessee. And man, that's the first time I had ever experienced any racial tension. It didn't exist in Salinas at that time. So I looked and I saw a world from a different one that I grew up in.
I was wondering if you remember, or if anybody knows about this, when Pearl Harbor had been the bombing in the Japanese, I grew up in Monterey, but this was before I was born. There were a lot of people, the fishermen in Monterey, and a lot of them were taken out of their homes in Monterey, brought to Salinas to live because they thought, the Japanese people thought that they were spies. Do you
Yes.
remember that?
Well, I don't remember that. Thank God I was not
Well,
born yet. But,
right.
But I
think it
do
was-
know about that.
Yes.
And the difference between that policy with Germans and Italians and Japanese is that with the Italians and the Germans, it was systematically. I mean, with the Japanese, it was very systematically carried out. All Japanese people were interned, whether you were a citizen or not. That's the horror of it. For the Italian community and the German community, it tended to be if you were elite members, if you were involved in politics, you might have been arrested. There was an uneven carrying out of policy. Many Italian families in Monterey were not clear on the concept of having to move off the coast, and some of them just moved to San Francisco without penalty, which was on the coast, right? They were supposed to move off the coast. They knew they had to move. And there was attention paid to whether or not you were a citizen or not. So if you were an American citizen and you were of Italian origin, then you really didn't have much to fear. And the problem was that within families there were many non-citizens. So it was an uneven policy for Italians and Germans. It was very, very carefully carried out for Japanese. That was the big difference. And so it was pretty devastating. But it was devastating for everyone. It was a confusing time. And, you know, we all understand racism. It's very hard to see racism, especially when it's not directed at you. If it's not directed at you, then it's easier to say it doesn't exist. If it's directed at you, then you notice things. So I think that might be the difference in Salinas. There was certainly racism in Salinas and continues to be, but it's harder to perceive if you're not of the group that's being treated badly. But yeah, that is a story. That is an important story. And Angie, you are investigating that. Yes, that's the story. Okay, please.
I've been chomping at the bits here. I'm Augie Skornianki. I grew up on Del Monte Avenue. Went to school in Alisal. Went to school at Alisal with Jim, Salinas High. I'm a Hartnell graduate. And I've seen two attempts to tell the story of Alisal, and the Italian American is left out. And when I grew up, we had a mom and pop store on Del Monte Avenue.
I won't leave it.
All up in Williams, Sanborn, there were Italian stores, Italian American stores. Our migration pattern was a little bit longer than yours. Many Italians that ended up in Salinas grew up in a small village in southern Italy, affected by the Depression. Southern Italy was really wiped out. Moved to Chicago and then to Salinas. That was our pattern. So a lot of people from our village settled in Alisal and Salinas.
What village?
Pianigrate, which by Cosenza, southern Italy.
Sicily.
So that role of the Italian American grocer is not told, and it hasn't been told in two stories. I can remember being on Del Monte Avenue, a knock on the door. We lived behind the store in a house at midnight that an Okie or an Arkie or a Texan needed milk or an aspirin or bread. My dad would get up, go in the store, and give that to him. And that was pretty typical of the Italian grocery stores around here. We were part of that pattern, and I get upset when it's not told.
Don't worry, it'll be told.
Okay, but that was an important story, and we did get along. And in the hierarchy, I think we were a little bit above the Texans and the people from Oklahoma.
Dream on.
Yeah, where was your grocery store?
Peace Market on Del Monte Avenue,
What farm?
1255.
1255.
We delivered groceries out on Ostage Road to some of the ranches. We might have delivered to your...
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Were you with the Rickards?
No, Skornianki's. Skornianki's.
Yeah.
But there were stores on, probably 8 or 9 Italian stores. And then when Safeway came in, it wiped us all out.
Yeah. What year was that?
We had the store from 1947 to I think it was in Alisal 53.
That's why I didn't know your family.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi.
Interestingly enough,
You're gonna have to
my father
lift
had a
that.
little store.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Karen Cameron.
Oh, wait a sec, Karen, can you hang on for 1 second?
Sure.
Interesting enough, my father had a little grocery store in the corner of Roosevelt and Wood Street, so Mr. Monteith knows that area well. I know those little areas that you were talking, those little 15 by, I know those places well. But it's very typical of what you see when a lot of fairly new people come in. There's mom and pop stores that pop up all over. And I remember we went down there, and I remember with my brothers and aunts and uncles, we poured the concrete, stood the walls and put, we had no money, so we used metal, corrugated metal on the exterior of the building as well as the ceiling. I don't even think the walls were insulated or anything, and we just sold to all of our neighbors, so it was, and I remember Augie, and their
If I may tell one story of my
Yeah.
dad, though. I don't know if you remember, we had those long things with the receipts that you came in and you bought groceries, and my dad would write it down and you'd sign it. And you put their name in there, and you had the long box. Well, my junior year, between my junior and senior year from college, I came home, and I'm really smart then, right? So I look at the book and I count it up, and there's $3,000 in due bills. This is 1957. So I said, Dad, you're crazy. Let's go get it. And he says, go get it. You can have what you want. And some of the people still lived in town. I knocked on 3 doors, and the poverty was there, and I gave it up. So I came home. My dad said, how did you do? And he laughed, and I sat down.
We had the same boxes with those little things that each
Yeah,
bite,
remember
you
those?
gave them a receipt, you kept one that stayed in there, and hopefully they would come on payday and
Yeah,
clear
they
it.
hope.
My father was very generous, trusted everyone. Ultimately, it didn't work out for him. After a couple of years, he had to close the store, but he was too generous.
Hi, I'm Karen Cameron. I teach 3rd grade in the Alisal School District, and moved here in 1974 originally when my mother, Marlis Mayer, became the director of Hardnell College, and I think a few of you know her. She worked very actively with Anna on many campaigns. I had 2 questions. One, can anyone comment in terms of the Native American period in Salinas? And also in terms of land development and growth. Clearly, we're the salad bowl of the world. Agriculture is so pervasive. Pesticide spraying is a concern near properties and school. And I'm just wondering if you can comment on the development. You talk about the days when it was just fields. And now we're a whole different community. So what can you say about the planning and the purposeful decision-making that went into developing this community to balance agriculture and the health of its people?
Great question. Well, Anna, do you want to answer that in terms of environmental?
Yeah, I think there are a number of issues that, in terms of planning and the challenge is you start with what's already been built, and then you figure out what are the needs of the community and how are we going to address those needs given kind of the rules that we live under in the state of California. So one of my frustrations has always been that we'll come up with a plan, and then the school districts will decide where they're going to put their schools, and they move out into ag land, and they put them on the outskirts, out in the middle of ag land, and then they want everybody around, all the agriculture around, to change, like they didn't know that it was agriculture. And the challenge is that the schools have the right by law to put the schools wherever they want to. They don't have to check in with the city. And so the challenge is you get complaints about why are they out on the outskirts, like the new high school, for example. That's way in the heck out there. And McKinnon School, I think that's the name of the school, is out in the middle of ag land. So the challenge is looking at policies and trying to figure out what should happen, and then other entities that could come in and do something entirely different. Now the city will grow out there, and ag will be displaced eventually because there will be homes, but you don't control the timing of when the construction happens and how things are going to happen. So in reality, Salinas is one of those cities that has really focused on not hopscotch development, where you end up with ag land or fallow land and then homes way out in somewhere else. If you drive on Baranda Road, you know that if it's a house, it's city. If it's not, it's not been annexed yet. And so some annexations will happen over the next number of years. But let me tell you some concrete things we tried to do when I was on the planning commission and on this in the city, because that's a combination of about 24 years. I was on the council, well, it's about, my math, 15 years on the council and almost 5 years on the planning commission, is that one of the trends in Salinas was, well, first of all, is if you bought something and you wanted to move up into a larger home, you either bought it in South Salinas or you had to move out of town. That was the reality back in the 80s. And I say that because I bought a small home here in East Salinas, and then our family grew and we needed more space. And if you moved to South Salinas, you paid a lot of money because it was in high demand. And so we prioritized the development of bigger homes, number one, to stabilize the community because people were moving out onto Highway 68 as a way to get a bigger home. And it was taking people who really wanted to live in Salinas and moving them out of town. And that's a brain drain in the community. And so that's why you see Creek Bridge and some of the development in Salinas on an alternate route and didn't have to use Laurel. And so that's, we set up that system so that you paid for the roads as you were building. And then we created a park fee and a library fee because we had a real lack of park space and a lack of library space. The reason that Cesar Chavez Library is so big is because of all the fees that were paid in this region. And the reason we have a 64-acre park that joins East Salinas with North Salinas is because we needed to ameliorate the lack of park space in East Salinas. And that park has yet to be finished because new development has to pay for the rest of the park, for there to be a rec center and development on there as well. So there were some concrete goals. The other thing is we wanted to have the auto center stay in town because they do generate important revenue. And we were looking for some hotels because they also generate revenue for the city. That's really, they're no services, but they do provide transient occupancy tax. So those were the things. And the other part of it was a big part of Salinas is the downtown area because that's the heart. That's where Salinas started, and it's where the old homes and the old architecture is located. And when the mall was built out in North Salinas, it decimated economic development in South Salinas. And so we wanted to bring that back. And we wanted to create an opportunity for there to be housing in that area as well. Some things have been successful, some have not been as successful. But that was what we were trying to do. And I think people would generally agree that bringing in the Steinbeck Center, or creating it there, and the theaters has been a good addition to the downtown area because it's brought people back downtown in a way that creates a livable, living, breathing kind of downtown. And I'm proud of that because that was one of the things we wanted to work with, that we worked on. I tell people that if you remember Salinas, there was a time when you could roll a bowling ball down Main Street at 5 o'clock in the evening and you wouldn't hit anybody or anything because it was dead. And there were homeless sleeping in the alcoves. And it was scary and dangerous. And it's not that way anymore, but it takes years of planning. And
What time are you thinking about?
Let me see. It was probably would have been
The 70s?
Yeah, I would have said the 80s for the most part too. It wasn't until what we did is we did some eminent domain, which is always tough, and we brought in
one or two people in the room that don't know what that is.
that is when the city takes over control over property, it buys it, sometimes forcibly without the owner's consent, and then we put money. We put $3 million as seed money into the Steinbeck Center because the fundraising efforts weren't very successful, and then set up a system where the group that was working on it could fundraise around that, and many of the people that are here were instrumental in that. It took people who had a real commitment to the city to say, I want to sit on this board and I'm going to raise the money, and it was done all locally. And that the plan had been to have a very small center, and when they raised, I want to say $10 million, they were able to get the bigger lot right there on 1 Main Street, and that changed the dynamics and brought in the theater and other things that are down there.
So you saw the impact of Northridge Mall almost immediately.
Well, I
But
was
that
in-
was a negative impact
I
almost
wasn't here.
immediately.
I
Okay.
wasn't here, but
Okay.
So I wasn't here, but I know that there were major spaces where I was told were Sears, J.C. Penney's. You can remember the stores better than I, because I never saw them, both on South Main and in downtown, that moved up to Northridge Mall. And so what it did is it kind of sucked the life out of people spending money in South Salinas.
Peter, you had a question?
I'm Peter Cassavan. I'm an architect. I'm actually a second-generation architect. My father started the firm in Salinas in 1949. He designed Alisal High School, as a matter of fact, as well as North High. I have photos of those schools when they were just built and they were surrounded by farm fields. So one of the challenges is, where do you find 40 or 50 acres within an urban fabric to build a school? So most of them are forced to move out into green fields to do that. But I also think there's a lack of coordination of planning. I'll get back to a question about Alisal in a second, between the city and the school districts, because we also designed the Bronda Meadows School District for the Salinas City Elementary School District. And by the way, I'll give a shout out to Bill Ramsey, who was on that board. He was the president of that board. I saw it on some of an old letterhead from that school district in my dad's files. So. But there was a lot of resistance from the city and the county as well to develop that Bronda Meadows off of Davis Road. And one of the challenges I had for the Salinas Planning Department is, well, where did you plan on the schools being built? Because they don't talk to the district. So there's an opportunity there to coordinate that. Just a comment about downtown, there are some photographs of Salinas downtown in the 20s and 30s. The streets are full of people walking, pedestrians. There's 3 hotels. There's signage all the way. There's many different choices. And I think the Valley Center was called that for a reason. It was the center of the valley. And you could shop there. There's toy stores. There were restaurants there. And I think Salinas has really done a very poor job in planning because we had a more metropolitan, vital city in the 30s than we do today. Back to the Alisal. I have a question, because I've grown up hearing about how the Alisal has been ignored or mistreated by the city, and they don't get the same things that South Salinas has done. And one of the things that happened is that there was district elections, and the Justice Department said we had to break up the city into districts. And as I recall, this was after, Anna, you were elected to mayor as the first Latina mayor.
No, the district elections happened in '87.
But weren't you on the Salinas City Council at the time? Well, one of my questions was, is that true about the Alisal, that they were ignored by that? And has this changed? I think it's a fairly fundamental change, because the leadership got distributed between different areas in the city, what the impact on the Alisal was from that.
Yeah, I think what happened is that the district election vote was in 1987, and then we had our first, and it was successful, and then the city was divided into districts, and then the first election was '89, and that was when Simon Salinas got elected from East Salinas. But you raised a really good point. There's no question that the downtown, if you look at the pictures, was more vibrant at one point. But what happened is that, and I don't know what the timing was in terms of the development up near Sherwood, up in North Salinas. I don't know when those homes started to get built. My guess is the 50s and the 60s.
After the war.
After the war. I would have said the 50s and the 60s, because they looked like the style of the 50s and the 60s. But part of what Salinas suffers from is a sense of somebody else is getting a better deal than my neighborhood or my part of the community. So there's a North Salinas, then there's an East Salinas, and there's a South Salinas. And when I was on the council, we did outreach, community meetings in every part of town for a variety of different reasons. And everybody always thought somebody else was getting more money or more resources. And I think part of the problem is just that there's never enough. That's why I said, you know, we're a blue collar community in terms of the revenue that we have. We never have enough. And so the economics of the community is Alisal produces one of the highest sales tax rates in the city for the size that it is. And if you discount the auto center, because they're kind of an entity on their own, and you look at Northridge Mall, Westridge, and East Salinas, I think East Salinas was always the number one behind the auto center. And it could be different now. I haven't seen that data in a long time. And I think the reason is because East Salinas is a cash and carry economy. People earn a paycheck and they spend it all because of the necessity and the need. And they spend it within their neighborhood. And so it's really vibrant economically. What happened when the mall came in, from my perspective, is that they stripped everything from South Salinas other than the grocery stores and the small little mom and pop places. That whole Department of Social Services took up that whole block where the old Sears used to be. And so you moved all of that out to Northridge. And so the challenge is that trying to bring back what was lost for the downtown has always been a challenge, because you're not going to get the big box retail, you're not going to get the big stores there anymore. It's got to be the kind of things that people really appreciate and like. It's one of the reasons I don't shop in any of the major chains, because I feel like I want to spend all my money on the mom and pop stores and the restaurants that are locally operated, because they have a hard time. And when we were doing a lot of the work in downtown Salinas, what I was told don't bring Maya theaters in, nobody will go to the theater downtown. And don't worry about white tablecloth restaurants in downtown, because who wants to eat in downtown when they can go to Monterey and Carmel? And that really irritated me as the mayor of Salinas. It was like, I do. And I used to go to a white tablecloth place. I don't know if you remember it, right across from the train station. It was this tiny little restaurant that had was like this little hallway, but it was the best food. And people used to say, nobody will. And they moved out of town. But the challenge, I think, is that we really never have enough money. And you know, you look at North Salinas, the library is terrible. Finally, East Salinas has a great library, and it's vibrant and active and full of kids all the time. The South Salinas library needs some significant upgrading and some help. But you know, you don't get that unless you do the fees, and then that makes housing much more expensive, because you have these fees that people have to pay. So I think the challenge is that we never really have enough money. And so I agree with people who say we don't have enough money for the needs of our community, but it was always a sense of South Salinas gets it all, and that's not really true. I think district elections have really changed how people participate on the council, but I think the money that gets spent is fairly evenly distributed throughout the community. It's just that East Salinas still suffers because they don't have the infrastructure, because they were built to county unincorporated. And one of the reasons that some of it doesn't get done is because the property agreed to put money in to get it done as well, and they don't want to do it, and that was always part of the challenge.
Jim, do you have a comment?
I would just like to make a couple of comments, because I've spent most of my life in business on Main Street from one end to the other.
Yeah, I think this is better. That one's kind of going in and out.
And as I said, just a couple of comments, because most of my life has been in business one way or another, from South Salinas up to, I was a hairdresser for 12 years. We had a salon on South Main Street, across from Sears. And then later I had clothing stores in downtown Salinas, and then I also ended up with one in Northridge. I had 2 stores. So what happened is Valley Center opened up, and downtown, everyone went to Valley Center and left downtown the merchants. So their answer to that was to tear all the buildings down So we have this very narrow strip left on Main Street. They tore all the buildings on Monterey Street and on Salinas Street to create parking to compete with what was going on out in Valley Center. They also took beautiful brick buildings and put false aluminum siding on the front of it and covered them up because they wanted to be modern and look like what was going on in Valley Center. Valley Center was a game changer, and it was one of the first big outdoor retail areas in the state of California, about 1949, 1950, along in there. Then subsequently, Northridge builds and guts Valley Center. But in the meantime, downtown is struggling and has this very narrow commercial street there. That it's sad that there's no depth to it. What's encouraging is it's really coming back now because people are still looking for a shopping experience and a dining experience. And Taylor's building has been a godsend, and the theater and the Steinbeck Center. So I'm very optimistic about downtown and what I see is going on down there. We're starting to get the density, and what we need is some market rate housing down there. And because there's a lot of employees in the county and the schools and Taylor Farms and so forth. And I know that they're in the process of trying to do that and put some housing up on some of the parking lots, so you'll get the density that'll work. And then one other comment on the Steinbeck Center. When we finished fundraising for the Steinbeck Center, we had raised all the money it took to build that building, and we left pledges. We had paid for 10 or 12 million, and we had pledges for 2 or 3 million. What happened is they never met the operational projections that they had. They started using the pledges to support operations, and that's how the city ended up being short, is because they used the pledges for the building to cover operations for a while because it never met the projections that originally was set for.
Jim could sell ice to an Eskimo. But he has done all the things he's talked about incredibly successfully. So Salinas is changing, and business is also. As Peter well knows, he's building a high school down over here about 2 miles from here. Right, Peter? If you don't know the development of Salinas, it's right out the road, right off of Williams Road here, about where Baranda comes over. Is it Baranda? There are 2,500 acres that are going to be developed in Salinas. And the question, and Peter's building a high school out there on behalf of the city of Salinas. And there will be elementary districts out there. And you begin to wonder, well, who's going to buy the houses? Where's the money going to come from to buy the houses? And I was asking that question, and someone said to me, Bill, the folks from San Jose, there's no more land to develop. So we may well have an encroachment of the Bay Area down into Salinas to buy these houses that are going to be developed. And that will create some type of an income stream in terms of taxes to the city of Salinas. In the meantime, looking back over my experience, I think the city of Salinas has done as good a job as could be done to develop the schools to accommodate the potential growth of the area. I wouldn't know how in the world you do it any better than it has been done. There's a change going on in business, and it's called online buying. Those of us in agriculture see a lot of things, Harvey. When we talked about your mom and pop store losing out to Safeway, and now Safeway and other large chain stores are looking at online buying, and we in the produce business are looking at it also. So what I see is just an evolution. Within the agricultural industry, most of the changes have been evolutionary. There have been some revolutionary ones. And the biggest one I can remember when field packing came into being in the lettuce field. And we all went from the lettuce sheds in town to the field, and now we're still in the field. But we've come back to what used to be called lettuce sheds and now called plants, and we own one of them. So the evolution is there. The population is growing. And And in agriculture, we have figured out a way over time, always is this way, to build a better mousetrap. And what I'm saying, even in my tenure, 62 years, I watched us double the potential acreage. What I'm trying to say is the income from an acre of land today has been doubled since when I started in this business 62 years ago. So where there's a will, there's a way, and when there's an economic driving force, all those things will happen. So I see Salinas developing just about the way history would record that it has developed over the course of time in our country.
We have a question over here, and then Sam, you're next.
Hi, my name is Bernice House. I moved to the area 7 years ago, and I have a question regarding what's the proper way to call East Alisal or East Salinas? When I moved, it was like a controversy. Some people got upset with me. Don't call it East Alisal, don't call it Alisal, call it East Salinas. It's not Alisal. So I hear different feedbacks about how to call it, because at work I need to do some reports and kind of find out what's the proper description. I Google, I talk to people, and everyone have different answers. And I'm so happy to be here and able to ask that question. What would be so it is recorded, so people are upset with me can see what your recommendation is. Thank you. Alisal or East Salinas?
I cannot answer that question. Can anyone answer the question? Is it East Salinas? Is it Alisal? What is it?
You know, I think it's the eye of the beholder. I'll be real honest with you. I use them interchangeably.
Some people get upset with me when I say.
No, I don't.
Well, tell them to get over it. There are worse things to worry about.
But the real question there, I mean, I do agree with that. But the real question is, what is it about it that offends them?
Yeah.
Because I don't understand it myself. And I don't know that I've ever had a conversation with somebody that corrected me, maybe just because they just don't want to do it. But
that's a good question to follow up with.
It is. A really
Why
good
are you
question.
offended?
Yeah.
Why does it matter? Does it have to do with identity?
Yeah.
Is there some feeling of a overlooking an identity when you say one or the other?
Okay. Thank you.
I want to get back to the 1930s.
I'm not gonna walk over there.
Yeah,
My voice is loud enough. When I came over here in '56, I lived on South Hepburn, 28 South Hepburn.
Tell me your name.
Mary Ann Worden.
Nice to meet you. Let me give you a mic.
We had a post office on Wood Street. That post office name was Alisal, not East Alisal. It was Alisal. Even though that part belonged to the city of Salinas, and so was the Sherwood School was in Salinas School District. It was not in Alisal School District, and neither is Los Padres. That, I was told, was East Salinas area, even though my water bill came to Alisal, Alco Water. But our mail was Alisal.
This is helpful.
This was Alisal, California, not Salinas.
Okay.
Did not become Salinas until '63 when we joined. But it was never called East Salinas. And anything you received was called Alisal, right, Jim and Bill? And those three don't know, then nobody knows.
But you're making a point about the annexation too, that it was very strongly resisted, and it's about controlling your local community, and it was a contested issue for a number of years, and it was not annexed until 1963.
We weren't really wanted, no matter when you came into this area.
But people in Alisal did not want to be in Salinas.
That wasn't quite, some of them did and some didn't.
All right.
These three know about
Okay,
it.
let me get back to the question that's actually kind of like that. Was there a stigma growing up in the Alisal when you went to Salinas High School? Did kids go, oh, you're from the Alisal? Did they look down on you? Because Carol's making a great point about class, and from that, I agree with her.
I came from the, changed to Alisal School and went into Salinas High. And they all called me the little girl across the railroad tracks. Or then when I was going to get married, one of the fellas told my husband's uncle that he was going to marry me. He said, "Oh, she's from Okie town." I said, "What's he talking about? I'm not an Okie." and there was just that little, but you know, I always figured I was just as good as anybody else, whether I came from across the tracks or not. I was still me.
That's a great that's why you're 95.
Yeah. I mean, that's the way I feel
Great
about it. If
attitude.
you've got the
You're
drive,
right.
be good to people, you'll be all right.
Did you feel marginal? Did you feel like people looked down on you, Jim and Bill?
Did they look down upon us?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, the answer is yes.
All right.
Yeah. When I came into town, it was an eye-opener. Coming into town was going from
They're not
out south
friendly.
to
Yeah, they're not
Salinas.
friendly.
2 miles to walk to town.
Yeah.
2 miles from Fremont School to Alisal School. It seemed like it's 2 miles to everywhere. Yeah, we were looked down upon. Yeah, and we may have had probably an inferiority complex. We had come from Oklahoma, Texas, and Arkansas, and our families had lost everything because of the Depression. So probably hasn't it always been that way? Don't you always have to make your own way and prove your own point?
Bill, did they stop looking down on you the first time you hit them on the football field?
Probably made a difference. One thing about I'm going to refer to as Okies. Carol asked him one day, "Did you guys really think you were Okies?" I said, "Yeah, that's." Even when Virginia was talking to us a couple of weeks ago, she was talking about all of our Okie students. So yeah, Augie, what were your thoughts growing up out here and then coming to town?
Oh, I always felt isolated. In fact, in our 50th wedding, our 50th high school reunion, Jim, I don't know if you remember this, but 3 people had drank too much at the, and
Only
got up
3?
on stage and said, "You people from Salinas always crapped on us, and we're not going to let you do that anymore." This was 50 years later.
You know, I think we were sort of considered outsiders, you know, and I know that I was, my gosh, I can't believe the first time I went in a couple of houses downtown, and I looked today and they're very modest houses. I thought they were mansions. I'd never been in a house like that before, and I'd never been in a house. And your partner and dear friend of us, Don Nucci, I remember going in Nucci's house. God, I was like a mansion. I'd never been in a house like that. You know, and I remember going in Ingrid Eklund's across from Lincoln School. But look, it's a very modest, probably 3-bedroom, 2-bath house, single family. I went in there and I just looked like this. I thought, my gosh, look at this. This place looks like a mansion, you know. And I think that you're saying that I always felt a bit of an outsider because I didn't have much education, and I finally did go back to Hartnell later, pursuing another part of my life. But and I was always sort of in awe of those people who made it through, and Augie went on, did wonderful things with education, but I didn't do it in the normal fashion. So I always kind of felt like I need to stay in my place, and it wasn't quite there with all of those folks, and I had a great deal of envy for that, you know. So anyway, it was just part of life at that time.
In your head. Susan, did you have a question?
Not a question, not a question, but kind of a perspective. My name is Susan Aremus, and I'm a direct product of the Alisal. I was born in Salinas. I was born in Salinas Valley Hospital, the same as Jim. And we have a term in Filipino, and it's kababayan, which means townmate. And I have this in common with all of you on the panel. I went to the local schools, went to Fremont School for kindergarten, and I eventually was able to teach in Fremont. Went to Barton School, went to Alisal, and went over to Salinas High, graduated, class of '66. I'm a cowboy. But that was the time when I graduated, all the seniors were left in Salinas High, those who came from the Alisal, and they let the juniors and the sophomores come here to Alisal School. And we almost all of the seniors from the Alisal wanted to come and graduate from Alisal High, but they said no. So the graduating class, the first graduating class of Alisal is having their 50th class reunion today, I believe. And so that term kababayan still means that we are family. So I feel that we are family, whether we come from different backgrounds, different ethnicities, different races. But I have a comment, a perspective on housing, where we settled. My parents were immigrants from the Philippines. My father was a World War II veteran, and he worked in the fields as an irrigator out on Davis Road, on Blanco. He did all those jobs involved in agriculture. And there were just a few families, there were quite a number of families, Filipino families, that were raising their children in the Salinas area. But they wanted to move out of the camps, and then they found, they gathered their money and tried and found the Alisal was where they could afford housing. And so there were just a handful of families who came out to the Alisal. Were still working in the fields, but they had enough money. And from the stories that my parents told, was that when they applied, when they wanted to buy their house, there were petitions circulated in the neighborhood. We lived on East Alisal Street for 41 years, but at the initial influx of those Filipino families, there were petitions against having Filipino families live in the neighborhood. And I don't know how it changed, although that we were all able to buy our houses and raise the families there. And it might have been a negative experience for our family when we first started living in the Alisal, but it turned into a positive one because we made it our home, and we served our community. I went on to become a teacher and taught for 33 years, and I still enjoy that experience, and I really appreciated the diversity. It was, when I was growing up, there was more of a mix of different groups, and I took that in as a positive experience, and I tried to share that with my students and their parents, and to show that, you know, we were kind of all coming from the fields, working in those dire housing situations. But I always try to instill in my students that, you know, we can make it. We can do that. So I just wanted to share that different story among all those here who have a story to be told.
That's a critical story. And I think it's a good one to end on, because I think what we've heard from everyone in the audience, all of you, and on the panel, is that there was a lot of complexity here. These are not simple, it's not a simple progression. Alisal did not come out of a vacuum. It was the result of some national catastrophes and positives too. There was a new immigration, there were new developments in the agricultural industry that allowed people to move from migrant worker to settled worker to afford to buy a house. It was the first step towards home ownership and business ownership. There were problems associated with that, of course. The complexity doesn't make it boring. The complexity makes it more interesting. And the diversity of stories, the differences in stories make it more interesting. And the fact that policymakers like Anna have tried so hard to deal with these incredible challenges. So when we look at something like the location of a school, we can't just say the bad guys added pesticides. We need to say, why was that school located in this certain place? So we're going to ask all those questions and hopefully synthesize these multiple voices to make a new version of Salinas history that makes it even more interesting because of its complexity. So I thank you for coming, and we have little gifts for our panelists. Especially for Patricia, who is turning 95 tomorrow. So I'm going to pass those around. Thank you so much for being here.